The champagne glass in my hand was trembling before my mother even opened her mouth. "Why is this creature here?" She said it quietly, the way surgeons speak in an operating room. Precise. Contained. Meant only for me. 200 guests stood behind her in a stone ballroom lit gold by chandeliers, and not one of them heard what she just called her own daughter. "My name is Clara Bennett." I was 28 years old, and I had not spoken to my mother in 9 years. That silence ended at my sister's wedding, in a sentence sharp enough to open old skin. My sister, Nora, turned from her photographer and found my face in the crowd. She didn't look surprised. She looked disgusted, the way people look at a stain on a rented tablecloth. "You weren't invited," she hissed. She was right. She just didn't know who had invited me anyway, without knowing it. But to understand that ballroom, you have to go back 10 years, to a hallway in my parents' house, where 11 framed medical degrees hung on a wall, and one frame, at the very bottom, hung empty. I grew up the other daughter. Nora was 4 years older, and she was the one who came to the dinner table with numbers, class rank, test scores, science fair placements. I was the one who could splint an injured bird's wing and rebandage my grandmother's leg better than the visiting nurse, but froze the moment anyone put a test in front of me. My mother, Margaret Bennett, never screamed about it. Screaming was beneath our family's standards. She simply adjusted how much attention I was worth, the way you'd rebalance an investment that wasn't performing. The summer I turned 14, a 12th frame appeared on that wall, underneath Nora's Honor Society certificate. It was empty. When I asked what it was for, my mother smiled like a loan officer approving nothing. "It's yours," she said. "Pending." For years later, at my high school graduation dinner, 22 relatives gathered in a private room at the country club to celebrate Nora's acceptance into medical school. My graduation was the reason for the dinner. It was not the reason for the toast. My mother stood, raised her glass, and gave an entire speech about her daughter, the future doctor, while my dessert sat untouched in front of me. Everyone's back turned to the girl who had actually finished school that week. Near the end of the night, almost as an afterthought, my mother tapped her glass again. "And of course," she said, warm as a scalpel, "we should say something about Clara." Every face turned. She looked at me the way she'd look at an X-ray. "One daughter got the mind for medicine," she told the table, tilting her glass toward Nora. Then a pause, long enough to do its own damage. "The other got, well, an achievement is still an achievement. We celebrate what there is to celebrate." A few people laughed the hollow way people laugh at a boss's joke. I finished my cake. It tasted like nothing. I told her that night I wasn't going to medical school. I said it quietly, but I said it. She walked me to the hallway, tapped the empty 12th frame with one manicured finger, and gave me the family's entire philosophy in a single sentence. "In this family, love is earned. This frame is waiting. What you put in it is up to you." "Then it'll wait forever," I said. Something behind her eyes closed like a cash register. "Then it hangs empty," she said. "And everyone who visits will know why." She went to bed. I stood alone under a century of framed achievement, until the porch door creaked behind me. My grandmother, Helen, was sitting outside in her cardigan, 2 glasses of iced tea already poured, because she always knew. She'd spent 40 years as a night shift nurse while her own husband collected framed degrees for that same wall. She unbuckled the steel watch from her wrist, the one with the sweep-second hand she'd used to count 1,000 pulses, and fastened it onto mine. "That watch has sat with people through the worst night of their lives," she said. "It never once asked anyone their class rank." She squeezed my hand. "Nobody earns love, honey. Nobody." She stopped there. I wouldn't hear the rest of that sentence for 10 more years. 10 months later, my parents pulled the money meant for my education, $80,000, saved since I was a baby, and moved it into Nora's medical school fund. An investment goes where the return is, my mother said from the doorway, like she was reading a weather report. The ultimatum came not long after. Quit the home health aide job I'd taken, retake my entrance exams, get back on the family's path or leave. She used the words family trajectory, like we were a spacecraft that had drifted off course. I packed in 40 minutes. 2 trash bags, my certification folder, my grandmother's watch on my wrist. My mother watched from the top of the stairs. You're choosing to be nobody, she said. I'm choosing to be somebody you don't get to grade, I told her, and walked out the front door with my whole life in garbage bags. The porch light switched off before I reached the sidewalk. What she never understood was that leaving wasn't the end of me. It was the beginning. My first client after I left was a retired machinist named Walter, 84 years old, hands like tree roots, who could no longer manage the buttons on his own shirt. The agency paid me $11 an hour to be his hands. I learned to shave a face that flinched. I learned to time medication by my grandmother's watch. My family called this wiping strangers. What it actually was holding a man's entire dignity between my 2 hands for 8 hours a night, and never once dropping it. I kept a notebook of everything the agency did wrong. Missed handoffs, no-show aides, families left waiting by a phone that never rang back. Not out of spite. Out of the same instinct that made me re-bandage my grandmother's leg as a child. When care is done badly, something in me can't leave it alone. Then, the fall I turned 23, my grandmother had a stroke. I found out 2 days late from a neighbor, because no one in my family thought to call me. By the time I reached the hospice, visitor access was managed by whoever held medical power of attorney, my mother. I called every day. I drove 2.5 hours on my 1 day off, and stood at the front desk in my scrubs while a kind woman checked a clipboard. Immediate family only, she said. I'm sorry. You're not on the list. 11 days later, my grandmother died. I learned about the funeral after it was already over. But my grandmother had gotten one thing past that clipboard. A week before her stroke, she'd left me a voicemail. 41 seconds long. I know the exact length because the screen tells me, not because I'd ever once let it finish. The night I learned she was gone, I pressed play. I got 12 seconds in. Gracie, Clara, it's your grandmother. Don't you dare delete this. My thumb hit stop. A reflex. Her voice was alive, and I wasn't ready to hear it turn into the past tense. I kept that voicemail for 5 years. 5 years, and never once let it finish. Grief either buries you, or it pours a foundation. 6 months after we lost her, I took $12,000 out of a coffee can and a credit union account, and rented a 2-room office beside a dance studio. I called the company Brightwater, for no family reason at all. I just wanted a name that sounded like the opposite of a hallway full of frames. My hiring policy was 1 sentence. Hire the ones who show up. 5 years after that, Brightwater had over 300 caregivers across 3 states, and I had a title I still can't say out loud without hearing my 19-year-old self laugh. Founder and president. And then one ordinary Tuesday, a hospital called about a patient no other agency would take. The trauma surgeon on the line asked if my company was as good as its reputation, or just newer than everyone else's. Both, I told him. He laughed once, like a door coming unstuck. Come prove it. His name was Thomas Miller. He was 32, senior trauma surgeon. A man who wore quiet authority the same way my grandmother wore her cardigan, without needing anyone to notice. We argued for 20 minutes about discharge protocols. I won twice. He noticed the old steel watch on my wrist, and asked whose it had been. Nobody had asked me that in 8 years. 2 years later, we married in his mother's backyard. 30 guests, a barbecue, no wall of frames anywhere in sight. I mailed my parents an invitation anyway. 2 weeks before the wedding. One last old-fashioned hope I hadn't admitted to myself I was still carrying. The envelope came back 13 days later. It hadn't been marked return to sender. It had been opened, read, and resealed in a fresh envelope in my mother's handwriting. On the back in blue ink, one line, "Don't embarrass yourself." I put it in a cedar box with my grandmother's old watch strap. And every December after that, I still mailed a plain Christmas card. No photo. Just my name. Never once answered. 2 years ago, the hospital where my husband worked came to Brightwater looking for a founding sponsor for a new fellowship, training young doctors to actually understand aging patients. I had one condition, and it wasn't naming rights for myself. I asked that it be called the Helen Carter Fellowship, after a nurse who worked 40 years of night shifts and never got a single frame on anyone's wall. My own name would appear nowhere. Not on the plaque. Not in the press release. The first fellow selected that spring was a young internist with good hands and better manners, the kind of doctor who learns every caregiver's name. He wrote a thank you letter to the foundation, never knowing who was behind it. His name was Andrew Collins. This spring, that same young doctor sent an invitation to his wedding. He was marrying my sister. I almost didn't go. My husband said I didn't have to. But some part of me, the 19-year-old still standing at that empty frame, wanted to see if 9 years had softened anything at all. We sat in the back in a navy dress, quiet as wallpaper, planning to slip out before the family noticed the temperature drop. That plan lasted until I stepped onto the terrace for air and heard my mother's voice on the other side of a stone column. 2 families of physicians, she was telling someone, bright and lacquered. Can you imagine the grandchildren? Nora has always been remarkable. Our daughter, our only child. We poured everything into her. Our only child. I stood very still, the way you do when a wasp lands on your arm. I had braced myself to be the estranged sister, the awkward footnote. I hadn't braced myself to be erased completely. Erasure is tidier than hatred. It doesn't leave a body, just a blank space where a person used to stand. That was when my mother turned and saw me, and delivered the line that opened this whole story. She pulled me into a side hallway to keep the scene from her guests. My father was already waiting there, which told me everything about how this had been planned. He looked at me for the first time in 9 years and said only, "Use the side door. There's a corridor behind the kitchen. Don't make your mother repeat herself. Not how are you. Not even my name." "No," I said. He blinked like the word was unfamiliar to him. Maybe in that house it was. I walked back toward the reception instead of the kitchen. And that was when I learned what my sister had actually built her life on. At our table, my husband's colleagues kept greeting us warmly. Across the room, I watched my mother pick up the seating chart, trace it down to our names, and for exactly 1 second lose control of her own face. She had no idea who Thomas Miller was. 9 years, and she'd never once wondered. My sister found out faster. Brides always know their own seating chart. She crossed the floor in her enormous dress, saw our names beside the head table, and went the color of the tablecloth. She got me alone by the coat check. "Whatever you told his mother," she said, voice cracking, "you're going to walk it back." "I told her we grew up in the same town," I said. "That's all." "Don't do the calm thing," she snapped. "You had 9 years to ruin this. You picked my wedding. What did you tell them happened to me, Nora? What's the story?" She looked at me, and for the first time in her life she didn't reach for a number or a rank. She just said it plainly. "There is no story. As far as they know, I'm an only child." I had braced for a lie with detail, a scandal, a story about addiction or theft. The truth was simpler and colder. They hadn't buried me. They'd never once dug the hole. I wasn't a secret. I was an entry that had simply never been written down. I noticed something else though. Her hands were shaking. Not wedding day nerves. The kind of shaking I recognized from a decade of home care work. When a person is defending something much bigger than the thing you can see. Enjoy the toasts, I said, and walked back inside. The ceremony was lovely, in the practice way a hotel lobby is lovely. My sister delivered her vows the way she used to deliver honor roll speeches. Flawless, timed, faintly rehearsed. But sitting there, doing the same kind of quiet audit I'd run on care plans for years, I noticed the gaps. A dermatology practice with no lease on file. A grand opening no one could name a location for. A residency my mother steered every conversation carefully away from. Answering medical questions on her daughter's behalf before Nora ever opened her mouth. A pattern like that isn't nothing. It's a chart with pages missing. At the reception, the groom's mother, Patricia Collins, chief of medicine at the hospital, a woman with sharp eyes and the calm of someone who chaired 100 difficult meetings, came to our table with her hand already out. "Clara Bennett," she said warmly. "Andrew talks about Brightwater like it's a teaching hospital." Then, with easy curiosity, "How do you know our Nora?" One honest sentence would have detonated the entire wedding right there between courses. "She's my sister. Ask her why you've never heard of me." I chose the smallest true thing instead. "We grew up in the same town." "Small world," she said and moved on. But I saw her file something away. The pause before my answer, maybe, or the way my mother was watching us like an air traffic controller with two planes about to collide. Then the toasts began. My mother stood first, glass raised, and gave the performance of her career. Two great medical families joining, standards upheld across generations. A daughter who had never once lowered the bar. She ended with the family's oldest line. The one she'd once used on me at the bottom of a wall of frames. "Everything in this family is earned. Nothing is given away free at our table." 200 people raised their glasses to it. I kept my hands in my lap and for the first time heard the sentence underneath the sentence. She wasn't just saying it to me. She was reciting something someone had once said to her, at a table just like this one a long time ago. For one breath I felt something like pity. Then I set it down. You can understand where cruelty comes from and still refuse to bow to it. The band played. And then the groom stood up holding his notes, and went off script. "I want to thank two people who made me the doctor I am tonight," Andrew said. "The first is my mentor, Dr. Thomas Miller." He nodded toward our table. Applause. Every head at the reception turned. "The second," he went on, "I only get to thank because she's finally in the same room with me. I trained on a fellowship that paid my salary, my research, everything, named for a nurse who worked 40 years of night shifts. It took me 2 years and one careless mentor to find out who funded it. She built a company from nothing at 23, and half our hospital discharges would fall apart without her. She's sitting right there. Clara Bennett. Her grandmother was Helen Carter." The applause started, warm, confused, 200 people turning in their chairs. I stood because you stand when a good man asks you to. Beside me in pearl gray my mother rose too, not to clap. Her face had gone the color of old snow. "There's been a mix-up," she said, hostess smooth. "Clara is a distant relation. Complicated. Not for tonight." And my sister, who had kept 9 years of message discipline perfectly intact until that exact second, lost it all in one breath. "She wasn't invited," Nora said too loud, straight into the microphone's edge. The room went silent in a way that had texture. Andrew turned to his bride slowly. "The way you turn toward a sound of something breaking upstairs. Not invited? I invited her. Nora. This is the woman who paid for my fellowship. This is my mentor's wife. Her grandmother's name is on my diploma." "How dare either of you?" my mother said, reaching for rank. "This is a family matter." "Which family?" Andrew said quietly. It wasn't really a question. Patricia Collins rose from the head table without hurry and looked at my sister with the stillness of a diagnosis arriving. Nora, she said, you told us you were an only child. Nobody answered. That was the answer. My mother crossed the frozen room and took my arm with both hands, calibrating her voice to reach exactly the first 3 rows. Clara, darling, we'll discuss family matters privately. This is a wedding, darling. 9 years. A returned envelope. A hospice visitor list with my name missing. And I'd graduated to darling in under a minute, now that there were witnesses worth performing for. I lifted her hands off my arm gently, the way I used to lift Walter's when he reached for something he couldn't quite manage. You have no idea, do you, I said, about anything after April. Then I turned to Patricia. Excuse me. I need some air. My mother followed me into the stone corridor outside the ballroom, and there, with no audience left to perform for, she finally dropped the act completely, her back against the wall. Her hands, I noticed for the first time, trembling. Here's what happens now, she said. You come back inside. We say we've always been close quietly, private but close. You come home for Sundays. Thanksgiving. The frame. Her voice actually caught. The frame gets filled. You've finally earned it. There it was. The door thrown wide open, with everything I'd wanted at 19 arranged neatly inside it. All I had to do was carry one lie across the threshold. I looked at her shaking hands. My father made me recite my class rank at that table every Sunday until I left for college, she said, quieter now. I gave you a family that keeps score because it's the only kind I was ever given. And it worked. Look at Nora. We both heard it land the wrong way. It worked. Floating over a wedding that was currently falling apart one room away. No, I said. The frame stays empty. I built my own wall. I took my husband's arm, thanked Patricia Collins for a lovely ceremony, and walked out through the front doors, spine straight, at the pace of someone who finally had somewhere else she needed to be. We didn't drive off dramatically. The valet line was long, and old houses don't fall on anyone else's schedule. We just walked to the far end of the terrace and stood in the cool dark while the party glowed gold behind the glass. My hands started shaking then, the honest kind, the kind you've actually earned. I opened my phone. The file was still there. Grandma Helen. 41 seconds. For the first time in 5 years, when her voice reached the 12th second, my thumb didn't move. And I need you to hear this, honey, she said, because nobody ever told your mother, so she never learned how to say it to you. Somebody in this family has to go first. Nobody earns love, honey. Love is the thing they can't bill you for. Whatever they do with that silly wall. You were never the empty frame, Clara. You were the whole wall, and the house it holds up. Don't you dare wait for people with ledgers to tell you what you're worth. Come see me Sunday. Bring nothing. I cried finally, standing on that terrace in my husband's jacket, my grandmother's watch ticking against my wrist like a second heartbeat. Not for the family I'd lost. You can't lose what was never truly given to you. For the woman who'd said it first. And for the 19-year-old at the mailbox who could have used those 41 seconds a little sooner. The wedding didn't survive the month. The dermatology practice turned out to have no lease, no license, no grand opening waiting anywhere. My sister's residency had ended quietly years before, not paused, ended, and everything since had been a story my mother had narrated on her behalf. Andrew filed for an annulment, kindly I'm told, and kept the Helen Carter Fellowship listed proudly on his signature. My mother resigned from every committee. She'd built her name around that fall. Nobody fired her. Nobody needed to. Her currency had simply stopped working in every room that had ever mattered to her. My father sent one email in November. No subject line. Your grandmother would have been proud. I read it more times than I'll admit. I never answered it, and I've stopped needing to. The wall in that house still hangs, 11 frames and one empty space. Nobody's taken it down. Some systems don't come down all at once. They just lose their grip on you one person at a time. 6 months later, on an ordinary Sunday, I looked down my own dinner table the way my grandmother used to count a pulse, unhurried, grateful. My husband was arguing playoff brackets with an old client's granddaughter. 3 of my first caregivers were there, the ones who'd shown up before Brightwater could afford to pay them properly. And so was Andrew, still a Helen Carter Fellow, still family somehow, telling a story with his fork in the air. On our dining room wall, there are 11 frames too. I counted them once and laughed until my husband came to check on me. They hold a fishing photo, a coffee can from the early days, 2 wedding pictures, and a woman in a cardigan on a porch swing, caught mid-sentence, saying something the camera couldn't quite keep. Not one certificate among them. The watch is still on my wrist. The voicemail is still on my phone. These days, I can let it play all the way through while dinner cooks. If a family ever made you feel like you had to earn your seat at their table, I want you to hear this the way I finally did. Love that has to be earned was never love at all. It was a job with no wages, and you're allowed to quit a job. The table you build after that will hold every person your old chairs never fit.